This lecture covers basically the content of Chapter 4 of the textbook of this course, Living God's Word, uh, of Biblical Worldview 1. It also, very rapidly, in this quick survey of Old Testament stories and ideas, covers the basic overall ideas of the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, or the Torah. Torah is a term that in Hebrew is used for the first 5 books written by Moses of the Old Testament. The Pentateuch is the Greek word for that. It means 5 books. So the authors have decided to group under the idea of commandments the basic content of Exodus, the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So an overarching theme for the whole Bible, which continues through these books, is the idea of how God plans to fix that which man broke. So the continuing picture of salvation. So the main idea of deliverance, and of course in this case it's deliverance of Israel, of the descendants of Abraham from Egyptian captivity, is the overarching story, but it is meant to be viewed in a larger perspective of God delivering all of mankind from something really bad. But there's also the second part. It's not just delivering, but it's also bringing to or entering into a relationship with God, being delivered into something good, not just delivered out of something bad, but also delivered into something good. From Egypt to the promised land, from separation from God and good to delivery into something good, the promised land, home, all of the above. All of these ideas and concepts are to be viewed as kind of a backdrop to the specifics narrated in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy with regard to what happens to the descendants of Abraham, the Hebrew people. Deliverance into something is maybe sometimes viewed as kind of like an adoption. The children of Israel are in a terrible orphanage. They're separated from their home. They're separated from where they're supposed to be in a foreign land in Egypt. And God comes in through Moses, and he adopts them. He brings his people, his children, out of no man's land, out of an orphanage of history, so to speak, and brings them back to the table, back to the home, back to the where they need to be, back in a family, back under the protection of their father. So maybe the metaphor of adoption is one that is useful in seeing how this all plays out from a larger perspective. Now, something that I'm adding that's not in the textbook, so I'm calling it a personal note. This is about laws and legislation. Moses is not just a liberator, but he's also a lawgiver. And it kind of depends, I guess, on each person how we react to laws, rules, boundaries set by someone. Because God not just does he liberate the Hebrew people, but he also then gives them rules by which to live and act. And sometimes in our day, as it has been in the past as well, boundaries, laws, speed limits, can't go there, stay here, may be viewed, especially in our time, but maybe in the past as well, negatively. That is, we may react to someone saying you can't do that, don't do that, only do this, negatively. We'll make a quick note about that maybe human tendency to react negatively to boundaries. Boundaries are aplenty in nature. Just a quick note on that. In the Old Testament book of Psalm 8 and verse 29, there is a artistic yet real reference to the fact that God, when He created this world that we live in, actually gave boundaries to some of the powerful presences, natural presences, forces that He created. For example, the sea and water in general, but the sea in particular. So you have a couple of images now of a massive wave, and then of a beach perspective of man of the beach. So when God when He created the seas, He separated the earth from the waters, and He gave the waters boundaries. And what is very real, especially if you've experienced it sometime, is when the waters of the sea, when the waves of the sea doesn't respect its boundaries because of a tsunami or a hurricane, well, then suddenly we have a tragedy. That is, we have destruction of property, loss of life. When we sit and watch the waves roll in on a peaceful beach, we should keep in mind that it is good that when the sea respects the boundaries that God gave it. But when it doesn't, because of a storm, a crisis, an earthquake under the seabed, or powerful hurricane winds, well then we are keenly aware of the blessing that boundaries are to such natural things as the seawaters. This is just simply to remind that while we may react negatively to boundaries, we count on them in so many ways in nature. And what they're there is to remind us that boundaries really are there to protect. So as you think about the commandments that Moses will bring down from Mount Sinai to give to the Hebrew people, maybe we should not be so quick to react negatively to the fact that God sets boundaries. He created the universe, He created the world, He created mankind, and therefore He knows mankind better than mankind definitely knows itself. And boundaries are there for protection, not to cramp our style or cramp man's freedom or style. They're there actually to protect. Just a thought, a note before we enter into the specifics of this chapter. Now, what are commandments? Again, that is a very important aspect, especially as we look at how they play out in the life of the 600,000 to 1 million descendants of Abraham that now exist in about the 15th century before Christ, about 5 centuries after Abraham started this lineage. They have been greatly blessed with numbers, and they have now been brought out of captivity. And now Moses, the liberator, becomes the lawgiver. There are, some scholars count 613 commandments that God will give to Moses to give to the Hebrew people, that will define the terms by which the nation of Israel can have, if it abides by them, if it pays attention to them, if it obeys them, a wonderful life in the home that God is taking to them, the promised land. God promises to live with them, live among them, but of course He can only do so under certain conditions. And the laws are the specifics. God is not vague. God is very specific. He's so specific enough to give 613 commandments. And they are, again, a important principle. God made man, and man is not meant to make up rules for living as he goes, because he has he lives in a fallen world since he was cast out of the Garden of Eden, and he has not had a good history of doing things on his own. So God is specific. God does not leave man to flounder, the Hebrew people. He gets very specific with specific commandments. But of course, the children of Israel will still retain free will and the need to use their own capacities, intellectual, spiritual, emotional, moral, to understand and apply these commandments, but they're very specific and they are numerous. So the latter part of Exodus, which of course we've already dealt with the first part in dealing with the exit from Egypt and Moses and Pharaoh. The second part of the book of Exodus, the second book of the Pentateuch, the Torah, is about encountering God on Mount Sinai and receiving the commandments that will serve Israel for 15 centuries until the climax of the narrative when Jesus comes and gives a new set of commandments, a new set of rules. But they will serve, these are meant to serve in history for the Hebrew people for 15 centuries and anybody else that would abide by them, not just the Hebrew people. So, Exodus 19, verse 6, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. God speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, and Moses is the leader of a kingdom, and there's going to be a kingdom of priests, even though there's one tribe, that is the Levites, that are assigned a particular role in serving the temple and the house of God and the tabernacle. It is the whole people, everybody, that's to be a kingdom of priests. And here a quick note about that word. What's a priest? It depends on what your background is, religiously speaking, whether we understand that word or not in its context. There are two words that in the Old Testament, two functions. Priests are those that deliver the offerings of man to God, from man to God, while prophets are those who deliver messages and information from God to man. So there are two very important functions in the Old Testament, prophets and priests. What God says to Moses on Mount Sinai is that the children of Israel are going to all be priests. And by the way, they all have to be a holy nation. Here another important term. Holy means set apart, different, not like everybody else. They're going to have to live up to a certain standard if I am to live among them. So give these words to your people. Now here is an image of the top 10, you could say, the most famous, the 10 Commandments that do in a very real way summarize all the other 603. The other 603 are case studies in so many ways. As a professor of law school would tell you, while these top 10, the most famous are the condensation, the summary of the way things are going to be if you're going to be a nation of priests and a holy nation in which God can reside. And of course, here they are. You shall have no other God before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You shall honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet. Let me make a quick note about this. Someone has said that of those 613, a greater number is do not, that is negative, you shall not. And a lesser number is the positive, you shall. Either way, they imply action, and it is at least a noteworthy thing that there are the boundaries, the limits are many. Do not do this. Do not do these things. These are kind of like, driving on a highway. There are guide rails. There are lines. When it says do not, that is what it's setting. It's like a guardrail. While the do's are, this is where you go. And then the guardrails, the do nots, are like, this is where you don't go. The God who made man, and specifically he's using, of course, his chosen people. Again, the children of Israel are not deserving or better in many ways, but they are chosen by God to be an example, a prefiguring of the new Israel, which is, of course, in the New Testament and in Christianity, the children of Israel are the prefiguring of how God cares for, governs, loves, disciplines his people. And here, God is specific. There are things that you do not need to do, and there are things that you do need to do. And there are 10 here that summarize the whole, and they are very important. The Ten Commandments provide the most basic foundational terms for how Israel should live as the people of God. They are the basic foundation. Let's give you, before the long sermon, so to speak, in 3 points, or in this case 10 points, what it's all about. You may note that the first 4 about how to get your relationship right with God. So reread the first 4, and you will find that this is the first thing you need to do, is get your relationship with God right. So the vertical, so you could say a line from man to God. Get the relationship right with God, and then the other 6 of the 10 Commandments, number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, are about how to get things right with fellow man. So the horizontal, the line between men and men. So very clearly, the 10 Commandments are not happenstance. They're very organized. They are about the vertical and the horizontal. Get things right with God first, then things will fall into place in your relationship with man. Very important aspects of the 10 Commandments. So here they are again, a summary, and here again I put them in that order that I've given you. The first 4, here they are: the relationship with God, how to treat God. You are not to take any other gods. Monotheism, 1 is the number. Now, a reminder to you that throughout the Old Testament there is a reference to God in the plural. So God is one person, is one, but in 3 persons. So the concept of Trinity, even though that word is not used in the Old Testament, is there throughout. One God, 3 persons. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is the way in which you and I are going to view that as you look at the whole story of the Bible. But the first thing you need to get straight is there's not polytheism. Polytheism is a man-made idea, many gods. That is not the way reality and truth is. And you will worship only Yahweh, only God will be only worshipped. Secondly, which is totally related, you will make no images. God is spirit. You cannot confine him to a statue or a painting or an icon. Don't make and don't worship any images. No graven image. This is a very important principle that the early Christians will get out of this second Mosaic commandment, and you will have no images of Mary, Joseph, Jesus. We have no idea what Peter, Paul, what they look like. The first 4 centuries of Christianity did absolutely no images of the fundamental people, Jesus. Again, that the characteristic. Jesus, long hair and a beard, is a 5th century after Christ image. Um, Jesus may have had a beard, probably did not have long hair, but that said, early Christianity kept that very important second Mosaic commandment in mind. So does, for example, Muhammad, founder of Islam. He was influenced somewhat by Jews and Christians in his 40 years of leading caravans through the Arabian desert. And when he founded Islam, he also kept that image. So you will not find any images in the Quran or in Muslim mosques. It is embedded in the second Mosaic commandment from God. Don't make images, no graven images. Thirdly, the name. The name is important. Don't use it to curse. Don't use it just flippantly. The name of God is important. The Jews will go to such extreme that, as you know, as we've talked about, they will not want to utter the name with fear of being disrespectful. So Jehovah, Yahweh, is again one of the names that is given to God, which is really 4 consonants. And then they added the 4 consonants, added the vowels of another letter, the word Adonai, into it, so they would not pronounce the name of God and violate the 3rd commandment. The 4th commandment is about 7. It's about a day. God, when he created the world, did not need to rest. So why did he do that? To set an example. I didn't make you to work 2 jobs, 3 jobs, 7 days a week. Didn't make you do that. You are to, there's a day in which you are to rest physically and, more importantly, spiritually. So the concept of the Sabbath day, even though in Christianity that day is moved from the Sabbath to the Lord's Day, so it's shifted by 1, the concept of keep the Sabbath day holy by ceasing work on that day is there. There's a time to work, and it is necessary, and there's a time to worship and to think of things spiritual. Make sure you make room for the spiritual in your life. That is embedded in the commandment. And to the nation of Israel and the Hebrews, it is the Sabbath, 7, very important concept. The other 6 shift. Once you got your relationship right with God, there is 1, don't make an image of him. He is spirit. Remember to keep the Sabbath and get your right relationship with God. Then you move to the right relationship with fellow men. So the horizontal. So with how to treat each other. So parents, don't take innocent life. God creates sex and marriage, and adultery is a big problem. Don't do it. Don't take stuff belonging to other people. Don't accuse falsely. Don't even desire other people's stuff, because that's the beginning of greed and taking other people's things. So here, 6 of the 10 commandments, the final 6 are about relationship with each other, with fellow man. What are the 613 commandments for? So that God can dwell in their midst. There's a promise and an implication of God's powerful and holy presence, which is clearly the overarching idea in the latter part of Exodus, from Exodus chapter 25 through chapter 40, and then moving on into Leviticus, one of the hardest books for us to read, because it's just like a collection of case studies of law, very specific to this ancient people and ancient culture. So, but it is all overarching about the specifics of how God can dwell in their midst. I will dwell in your midst. What are the important aspects of what follows next in the instructions of God given to Moses on Mount Sinai and passed down to the people is the conditions by which he will dwell in their midst. The images that you have before you are of physical structures, ruins, and in the artistic design of temples. The temple is a house of a god. And now, these are pagan divinities, man-made divinities. Of course, the most famous one in the picture on top is of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, the temple dedicated by the Athenians to their favorite goddess and their man-made pantheon of man-made gods, Athena. That is a structure that, even though in ruin today, represents some of the best artistry and sculpture and engineering and design ever in the history of mankind. It still represents a cultural peak for the pagan Greeks in the 5th century before Christ. But here's an important point. What's a temple? A temple is a house of a god. And the pagans will build many of these, and they're in these times that we're talking about. The image below is that of a kind of a reconstructed ziggurat in the city of Ur, in what we call Iraq today, ancient Mesopotamia. It was a house of a Mesopotamian god. The temples of these ancient cultures were seen as not like a church building now, in the sense that we go in them and we go to worship. The ancient view of a temple was that's where the divine resides, and the only ones who go in are the priests. And so I guess I bring this to your attention as we consider the instructions that God is going to give with regard to the conditions and where he's going to reside in their midst, in the midst of the Hebrew people. Again, I'm not trying to make a comparison between the God of the Bible and the pagan gods, but there's a similarity in that a temple is where, or a tabernacle, as we're going to see, is seen as a place, geographical place where God resides, and there are conditions to accessing it, who gets to access, how, when. This is something that we see also in cultures around the Middle Eastern world of ancient times. So there is a covenant formula that God has issued, and it's in 3 steps to the Hebrew people. I will be your God. You will have no other God. That is a kind of a secondary item. You will be my people. I will guide you. I will take care of you. But the third is, I will dwell in your midst. And this is why I introduced the idea of a temple or tabernacle, we're going to see first, that will then develop into temple. A place where God dwells geographically, physically, and conditions for accessing it. The presence of the divine within your midst. So, the writers of your textbook in this chapter emphasize this important point. That is, there is a promise and there is a reward for God dwelling in your midst, but there's also all kinds of conditions. That is, presence of the divine brings power, but it also requires holiness. You're not just going to casually walk up to God. That's not the way it is. It is not in consonance with the righteousness, the holiness, and the essence of God that you just casually stroll up to him or to the divine. So, the tabernacle. Before there's a physical temple, the children of Israel will have a tabernacle. God will reside, so to speak. I use that word reside in a very, very different sense than we normally do. You know, When somebody asks, where do you live? What's your physical address? I reside, and you give your physical address. That's where we spend a lot of our day, some of our day, sleeping, etc. That's not exactly the right verb for the divine, but where God is always found, in a sense, the first presence of God in their midst will be in a tent, a tabernacle. A tabernacle is a mobile tent-like temple where God's presence will live among his people. And that's one of the results of the giving of the law. I will be with you, promise, but here's the place and here are the conditions, and this is how you're going to organize it. And it's organized to a high degree of specificity. So here is an image of all the details of the tabernacle that the Hebrew people are going to carry around as they wander in the desert for 40 years. And then when they get into the promised land, they will take with them, and that will be the holy place of God for nearly 4.5 centuries before a permanent structure called a temple will be built by King Solomon when God decides that he can, gives him permission in a sense. God lives in a temple. And let me say this, God has appeared and God has lived in many things. And God has been in a burning bush. He's been in a pillar of fire. He's been. He appears in a whirlwind. He appears in many ways. The presence of the divine is not confined geographically, but in this case, the children of Israel are given a specific structure, and this first structure for nearly 5 centuries is a tent, but it's a tent with a high degree of divine organization. Holy place, Holy of Holies, of course, Ark of the Covenant, the veil, table of showbread, the bronze altar, candlestick, who can go in and out, how it's organized. This thing has to be taken down, transported, and set back up every time they move in those 40 years in the desert. And specific dimensions, specific rules. God is very specific to the Hebrew people. And what does this have to do with anything? Why does divine do that? Well, again, it is a test of obedience. When God does get specific, it probably behooves you to pay attention. When they take freedoms, when they fudge a bit, well, there are consequences to not listening to God when he's specific. Sometimes God does not need or do specific, but when he does, the question is, what do you do with it? The Hebrew people are called upon to do exactly the way it's done. Kind of like Noah was not given the freedom to choose what kind of wood he would use for the ark. He was told exactly what kind. Maybe Noah thought of arguing, well, listen, there's a lot more cedar or pine around here. Why do we have to use gopher wood? But that is not a conversation that is recorded. Here, high degree of specificity in the place where God is going to be found, reside, so to speak. Again, watch out for that verb. Don't read it our way, but look at it their way. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. So here you have, from Exodus 40, a very specific picture of God telling them when they can leave, move on, go to the next spot. And his presence is seen through a cloud and through fire, very specific, very visible, from physical eyes, 20/20 vision, you know God's there by certain natural elements that are present there. And it clearly implies God is not only with them, amidst them, and among them, but he is also telling them when to move on and when not. The book of Leviticus, this as we move quickly through this survey, instructs Israel how to live with the holy, awesome God in their midst. Leviticus is possibly the hardest of the Pentateuch books to read through because it is a collection of case studies, very intricate, not a narrative, not a story, but it is about how to live with God in your midst. And it's not just one of those man-made gods. It's the God of the universe that created everything. And his holiness, his righteousness, his awesomeness requires that there are conditions by which man accesses them and has him among them. So the book of Leviticus is mostly about giving the rules by which God will live among men. The central theme of Leviticus might be said to be holy, because I am holy. So there's, even as imperfect as all men are, there is a necessity, a requirement that you seek to be different, set apart. That's what the word holy means. Set apart, different than most of mankind, or some men, many men. Act differently. If God's going to be with you, you got to act different, be different. And the reason for that is because God is holy. You want to be like your Father. You want to be like the God of the universe. So when God is in your midst, things got to change. You got to be different. You can't just casually, accidentally, lackadaisically say, well, welcome God, hope you can accept me the way I am. God's presence, to God be with you, God requires that we change to be like him. If we want to sit at his table, we got to sit at the table at his conditions, not at ours. We don't make requirements. He has some that are implicit to his nature, the nature of God. A lot of Leviticus is about the very complicated sacrificial system that's going to be involved in the centuries of the Hebrew peoples dealing with the biggest problem they have, which is not really political freedom or having a capital in Jerusalem, but it has to do with sin. Sacrificial system is enshrined and given in utter detail by God to the Hebrew people to explain how bad sin is in God's eyes and how it has to be dealt with in a certain way. And Leviticus and lots of its laws are an attempt to explain the sacrificial system, and without a thorough understanding of that sacrificial system, then it's, in a sense, you don't understand the whole point of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, his blood, his body in the New Testament. The Old Testament is necessary to fully understand the new. The old covenant with the Hebrew people that God made, the sacrificial system that he gave in utter detail there, was in preparation, foreshadowing for the sacrifice of his only son, and the fact that sin requires blood, requires sacrifice. Without going there now, I recommend that sometime you read from the New Testament book of Hebrews, chapters 7 through 10. That goes into great detail. That was written by a New Testament author, either Paul or Barnabas or one of the others apostles, but it goes into great detail for Jewish converts to Christianity of the 1st century AD into the parallels between the Jewish sacrificial system and the new sacrificial system under Jesus, under Christianity, and how much better it is than the old one that God gave as a preamble or a prefiguring to the Hebrew people with Moses. The book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Pentateuch, and it's about how the Hebrew people tragically had a history of blowing it, of having good moments and then having moments when it lost itself. Disobedience is the term, and therefore continued wanderings in the desert. That's much of the overarching story of the account as told in the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers details how Israel refused to enter into the promised land, and as a result wandered in the wilderness. 40 years were not required by God. 40 years will be necessary because of disobedience and fickleness and ungratefulness and second-guessing God. And so many other reasons that could be given. And of course, as we see the tragic story of the Hebrew people, and especially that generation that was led out of Egypt so powerfully by God, and how they were not able to enter the promised land. Again, all those above the age of 20 were to die and be buried in the desert because of their disobedience. This is what the book of Numbers details. Reading from it that night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness." Again, it starts by second-guessing the kind of leadership that God gave them. They questioned Moses, grumbled against him, and his brother Aaron. And then they look back to the houses, and even in slavery, they forget the bad stuff and how they were yearning for freedom under the Egyptian overlords. They forget that, and all they remember is they had, a better menu. God only provides manna to eat, while back in Egypt they could have all kinds of options for dinner and supper. They forget their hard labor and their no hope ever of being free back in Egypt, and now they see themselves living in the confines of a desert with no, you could say, civilization or roads or running water, even though God provides water in a rock and it provides safety through dangers. They complain, and thus they look back at Egypt, forget the bad, remember only the conveniences, and they then wish death upon themselves, which tragically is what is going to happen to them. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So they question the appointed leader by God, Moses, and they want to have elections, and they want to go back to Egypt. Of course, short-sightedness, ungratefulness, and many other things clearly appear in the attitude and perspective of the Hebrew people as recorded in Numbers chapter 14. What you might notice in these chapters of Numbers is that Moses tries to intercede for his people. Like a good leader, he intercedes to God for them. Here is a conversation between God and Moses. God is answering Moses. The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them as you asked." And he's speaking, of course, to Moses. "Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb and we might add Joshua, has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. So God says there's a cost to being having an attitude, having the attitude they're having of contempt to the divine and of forgetting. If you've witnessed the miracles of God and then you choose to forget them, there is a price to be paid. In this case, they are not going to be allowed to go into the promised land, and it will only be those that have the kind of attitude like Caleb and Joshua that will be allowed in the promised land, and not any others. So the last book of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, is the fifth book, is the Deuteronomy. It is about terms, setting terms for a blessed life when God gets them into the promised land and God lives in their midst. That's what the book of Deuteronomy, that's what the central theme is going to be about. The Deuteronomy is going to define the terms by which Israel can live in the promised land. So again, God is specific and he gives boundaries. He is clear about what it's going to take to be blessed and to keep him in their midst. And if God does stay in their midst, then they're going to have incredible blessings. So again, they have a choice, and it should be a no-brainer. But of course, again, we saw ungratefulness, forgetfulness. A constant refrain of the Hebrew people is they forget, then they remember. God makes them remember. Again, forgetfulness and a need to remember the blessings that God has given in the past, so that we are not in a shallow way and superficially tempted to complain or to second guess the role of God in our lives, in their lives. Deuteronomy literally means, the word in Greek, second law. Deuteronomos literally translates the word Deuteronomy, the second law. It's a second presentation of the laws that were actually introduced by Moses, Mount Sinai, coming down from it in from Exodus 16 on through the book of Leviticus. So it's a second presentation of the law. The Hebrew people, in a sense, need a refresher course, especially those that are about to go into the promised land. The three challenges of the book of Deuteronomy are the following. Number one, remain faithful to God. That seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's not. Keep your word. You want to be children of His. You want His protection. You want His guidance. You want the salvation that He offers. Well, then keep your word. One of the most fundamental moments of this particular important idea is called the Shema, and it's in Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 5. Maybe you've heard it. A call, a refrain, a motto that the Hebrew people are to keep for all of their lives. Hear, O Israel. Here again, a call to all the children of Israel, all the descendants of Abraham. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Harking back to the first commandment. You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Later on, another element of the human condition, the mind, is inserted as well. But the point is, with all of your being, not one day a week, not with part of you, not with just your heart, not with just your intellect, everything. A reminder to you that God wants the whole human being to be involved and reflected in discipleship and worship and fellowship with Him. So, hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one, and you to love your God with everything that you are. The Shema, remain faithful to God. Again, this second part in particular, um, uh, this slide simply adds the verse 6, highlights it. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Now, of course, we know, as they did, that the heart is a beating muscle. But that said, heart is normally a place, a spot in our physical entity that we point uh, to point to our emotions, but also to our essence of our being, so to speak. Um, you are to these are to be not just external commandments, but they're to be internal. They're to be governing not just your outward actions, but also your inward thoughts, emotions, feelings, etc. The second challenge of Deuteronomy, first being remain faithful to God, the Shema, is to don't do like everybody else around you. Avoid idolatry. An idol is a man-made god, or a symbol, or a statue, or a painting, or something like that of a man-made god. Avoid idolatry. God defines from the beginning one of the major problems is to imitate people around them that are polytheists. And in particular, of course, they worship man-made gods, make images, etc. Avoid that. Don't go there. Remain faithful to me, number one. Avoid idolatry. Deuteronomy 6, verse 14 and 15. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God who is among you is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you. He will destroy you from the face of the land. So here is a reference to the fact that peer pressure, the majority of people around us do it, must be okay. Don't be driven in your actions and thoughts and choices by what other people around you. Choose for yourself. Now, the references of God as jealous and anger, those are, of course, human verbs, terms. God's anger is always righteous, unlike ours. God's jealousy is a righteous jealousy, unlike ours. So these are not to be understood in human terms. God's jealous in the sense that he created us, he loves us, he wants us to be at his dinner table in his promised land, and so he is jealous in that sense. And if we choose to serve man-made gods, as the Hebrew people are being warned, well, then he has to separate himself from them, and that it means destruction. So the third challenge of Deuteronomy is, besides remain faithful, avoid idolatry, it is to practice. Here again, a verb, an imperative command. You are to do it. You don't have a choice. Practice justice. Practice justice as defined by God. That's why God gave 613 laws. Some of them are about ritual, sacrifice. Many of them are about that, but some of them are about what it means to practice justice among men, and thus do not commit murder, do not steal, do not lust after your neighbor's wife, do not covet your neighbor's possessions. Practice justice with the poor, the widows, the weak. Practice justice. Deuteronomy 10 and verse 17. The Lord your God is God of gods, Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, shows no partiality, accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widows, loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourself were foreigners in Egypt. Just some quick highlights to this as we conclude. No partiality. God is no partiality. These are interesting ideas that come to us from 3,500 years ago in the law of Moses. Okay, he cannot be bought off. You don't bribe God with offerings. When you offer sacrifices, you're not buying his favor. That is something that man-made gods, man-made cultures, and polytheistic gods could do. They could be bought off. They would, lean your way if you would simply give them stuff. God doesn't need anything that we have. So very different view of the divine that you see here than man-made pagan gods. He defends the causes of the fathers. So you should do that in your man-made laws. He defends the widows. So you should do that in your cultural norms as you live out here on earth. He loves the foreigner. Remember, you were once a foreigner in Egypt, and therefore you should. That's enshrined in the Mosaic law and very clearly stated in the second law, Deuteronomy. Repetition of that law. So the quick outline of the book of Deuteronomy. It follows a basic structure. Some scholars point out of what are found to be treaties. One particular ancient culture of the second millennium before Christ, about the same time as we see the Hebrew people getting their law from Moses and as they enter the Promised Land. The Hittites were a prominent civilization in the areas that we call Turkey today, in that area to the north of the Hebrew people in the Palestine. Hittite suzerainty treaties show echoes of the kind of organization that we see in Deuteronomy, which is very interesting. There's a prologue, there's a presentation of the two parties. In the case of course, the Mosaic Law, it's God, and then the children of Israel, that's the two parties. There's the conditions of the treaty. God sets those. There's witnesses brought, and then there's blessings and curses. I mention this to you as a note that scholars make as they compare these writings of the book of the Bible and of the Hebrew people. This is, they follow a model that is of ancient cultures. That is, these works that we have reflect the ideas of God, the instructions of God, but they are framed within the kind of a model that we see in other cultures around them. This is the way it's going to be in the New Testament, by the way, too. The Apostle Paul is going to be inspired, and what he teaches is from God. But when he writes letters, he will write letters in the way that a first century letter was written. So that is kind of the similarity that we can make between these, the way in which the form in which Deuteronomy and is written out and organized and plays out. So, just concluding with final thoughts from your textbook, while the fulfillment of the covenant of Abraham, given to Abraham, still hovers in the background, it is Deuteronomy that now takes center stage as the dominant background for the story. It was set out with Abraham, but now the book of Deuteronomy and this second law will be the one that the Hebrew people will focus on as they move forward in time. The question, of course, will remain, and it is for you and I too. Will we be faithful? Will we avoid idolatry? Will Israel obey and therefore keep God in its midst? If Israel obey, they will be blessed. If they disobey, they will be judged. That is clearly laid out. There's no uncertainty. God doesn't redesign, revisit. He lays out the conditions that are clear. And then the children of Abraham, the Hebrew people, have a choice. What to apply? Your textbook points out these. God is the one that sets the terms for relationship with him. It's not a contracting. We don't set terms with God. He sets them with us. God can only be worshipped his way. When he lays out all the very complicated ways by which sin will be handled in the tabernacle, how you will approach him, how the high priest will atone for the sins of the people. It is God who sets them. And in the New Testament, we could say it's God who's going to set the ultimate way by which man will come to him, and that's through his Son, Jesus Christ. And that's the parallel. And thirdly, God is not a far away on some other universe or planet God. He is present, but he is also holy, and his presence requires that we aspire towards holiness if we want to be in his presence. This concludes chapter 4.